When most people picture the collapse of Rome, they imagine invading armies, burning cities, or corrupt emperors fighting for power inside massive palaces. But great civilizations rarely die from a single invasion. Long before the walls crack, the foundations begin to decay from within. And one of the fastest ways to weaken an empire is to destroy the value of its money. Rome was not brought down only by barbarians or political chaos. One of the deepest wounds came from something far less dramatic: a collapsing currency system. The Roman Empire slowly undermined its own economy, and in doing so, it created a chain reaction that weakened trade, shattered trust, and pushed the empire toward decline. What makes this story even more fascinating is that the same pattern has appeared again and again throughout history. To understand how it happened, we need to go back to the beginning of Roman power. For centuries, the Roman economy depended on a silver coin known as the denarius. Introduced around 211 BC, it became one of the most trusted currencies in the ancient world. Roman soldiers earned it, merchants accepted it across continents, families saved it as a store of wealth. The coin represented far more than metal. It represented confidence in the Roman state itself. As long as Rome remained strong, people believed in the value of its money. But maintaining an empire on the scale of Rome required enormous spending. Armies had to defend borders stretching across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Roads, ports, aqueducts, and public buildings demanded constant maintenance. Emperors financed military campaigns, political projects, and lavish lifestyles all at once. Eventually, the costs became impossible to ignore. By the 2nd century AD, Rome faced increasing pressure from outside enemies and internal instability. Tax income was no longer enough to cover growing military expenses. Raising taxes further risked public anger and rebellion. So Roman leaders turned to a shortcut that governments throughout history have repeatedly chosen. They reduced the silver inside the coins. At first, the change was subtle. Under Emperor Augustus, the denarius contained almost pure silver, roughly 95%. Decades later, emperors began mixing cheaper metals into the coin while keeping the same appearance and face value. By the reign of Caracalla, the silver content had fallen dramatically. And by the middle of the 3rd century, under Emperor Gallienus, the coin contained barely any silver at all. What had once been valuable money became little more than bronze covered by a thin silver coating. The government hoped people would not notice. They noticed. As confidence in the currency weakened, prices started rising rapidly. Goods that once required a single coin suddenly cost many more. Merchants became reluctant to accept Roman currency because they knew its value was shrinking. Farmers preferred direct barter instead of taking unreliable coins. Soldiers demanded higher wages because their pay no longer bought what it once did. The empire entered a dangerous cycle. To solve rising costs, the government created even more low-quality coins. But the more coins it produced, the less trustworthy the currency became. And the less trustworthy the currency became, the more prices increased. Sound familiar? This financial breakdown became especially severe during the crisis of the 3rd century, a period between 235 and 284 AD when Rome nearly tore itself apart. Civil wars erupted constantly. Foreign invasions intensified. Disease spread through the population. Emperors were assassinated one after another, some ruling for only a few months. Behind all the political drama was an economy falling apart. Taxes lost, meaning because the currency itself was unstable. Trade routes weakened. Farmers abandoned land rather than pay impossible tax burdens. Local communities became increasingly isolated. In many regions, people stopped trusting the imperial system altogether. The Roman government responded with desperate measures. One of the most famous attempts came under Emperor Diocletian. In 301 AD, he issued the Edict on Maximum Prices, a law that tried to control inflation by placing legal limits on the prices of goods and wages. Thousands of items were included, from grain and wine to clothing and labor. The punishment for violating the law could be death. But the policy failed. Merchants refused to sell products at artificially low prices. Black markets exploded across the empire. Trade slowed even further. Rome discovered an economic truth that governments have struggled with for centuries. You cannot force people to trust money that is steadily losing value. Eventually, the old denarius effectively died. Years later, Emperor Constantine introduced a new gold coin called the solidus. Unlike the heavily debased silver currency, the solidus maintained a stable gold content and restored some confidence to the financial system. It became successful in the Eastern Roman Empire, later known as the Byzantine Empire, and survived for centuries. But for the Western Roman Empire, the damage had already been done. The economy had been hollowed out over generations. Military strength weakened, trade networks fractured, public trust eroded. The empire that once dominated the Mediterranean no longer possessed the financial stability required to hold itself together. Rome did not collapse in a single day. It unraveled slowly, one financial decision at a time. And that is where the story becomes deeply relevant to the modern world. The Roman Empire believed it could solve structural problems by weakening its currency. Instead of confronting unsustainable spending directly, it diluted the value of money itself. Modern governments often use different tools, but the principle remains surprisingly similar. Throughout history, nations facing debt and rising costs have repeatedly turned toward monetary expansion, currency debasement, or excessive money creation. And the consequences are rarely pleasant. Take Germany after World War I, burdened by massive reparations and economic hardship. The Weimar government began printing enormous quantities of money to pay its obligations. At first, it seemed manageable, but inflation spiraled out of control. By 1923, the German mark had become nearly worthless. Workers rushed to spend wages immediately before prices rose again by evening. Families carried stacks of banknotes to buy basic food. Savings built over decades vanished almost overnight. Meanwhile, people who owned real assets like land, factories, or foreign currency often protected themselves far better than ordinary workers. The social consequences were devastating. Economic desperation fueled political instability, anger, and extremism that would later reshape world history. Decades later, Zimbabwe experienced its own version of monetary collapse. Facing economic decline, falling production, and growing government debt, authorities printed larger and larger amounts of currency. Inflation accelerated beyond comprehension. At its peak, prices doubled at extraordinary speed. Citizens watched their purchasing power disappear in real time. Eventually, the national currency became so unreliable that many people abandoned it entirely and began using foreign money instead. Again, the same pattern appeared. Governments attempted to escape financial reality through money creation, and ordinary citizens suffered the consequences. Even major modern economies are not immune to these pressures. In 1971, the United States officially ended the dollar's convertibility into gold under President Richard Nixon. This marked a turning point in global finance. For the first time, the world's dominant reserve currency was no longer tied to a physical commodity. From that point forward, the modern financial system became increasingly dependent on confidence, central banking policy, and government management. Since then, debt levels have expanded enormously across the world. Central banks have repeatedly injected vast amounts of money into economies during recessions and crises. Inflation may not always explode dramatically like it did in Weimar Germany or Zimbabwe, but purchasing power still erodes over time. The numbers quietly change while everyday life becomes more expensive. Food costs rise, housing becomes harder to afford, savings lose value, and many people work harder simply to maintain the same standard of living. This is why Rome's story still matters. The methods may evolve, but the underlying temptation never disappears. Governments often prefer short-term financial relief over long-term stability. Creating more money can temporarily ease pressure, but if trust begins to weaken, the consequences can spread through the entire economy. Money only functions because people collectively believe in it. Once that belief starts fading, the system becomes fragile. And in today's world, the stakes are even larger. Rome's crisis was regional. Weimar Germany's collapse was national. Zimbabwe's hyperinflation was largely contained within one country. But modern finance is globally interconnected. Debt markets, banking systems, stock exchanges, and currencies are all tied together in ways ancient civilizations could never imagine. A serious loss of confidence in major financial systems today would not remain isolated for long. It would ripple across continents. So what lessons can individuals learn from Rome's financial collapse? First, inflation is not just an economic statistic. It directly affects purchasing power, savings, wages, and long-term stability. Second, history shows that governments under pressure often choose policies that quietly reduce the value of money instead of openly confronting financial problems. Third, real wealth usually survives where paper wealth struggles. Throughout history, productive assets, valuable skills, land, businesses, and scarce resources have generally weathered monetary instability better than currency alone. And perhaps most importantly, never assume stability lasts forever. The average Roman citizen, during the height of the empire, probably believed Roman dominance would continue indefinitely. Few could imagine their trusted silver coins eventually becoming nearly worthless. Yet it happened. Civilizations appear permanent until suddenly they are not. The collapse of Rome reminds us that financial systems depend heavily on trust. Once trust erodes, everything else begins weakening alongside it. Trade slows. Social tension increases. Institutions lose credibility. Political conflict intensifies. By the time enemies arrive at the gates, the deeper damage has often already been done inside the economy itself. That may be the greatest lesson Rome leaves behind. Empires are rarely destroyed overnight. They decline gradually through poor decisions repeated over generations. And among the most dangerous of those decisions is the destruction of sound money. History may not repeat itself perfectly, but it constantly echoes. The Roman currency crisis was not simply an ancient economic accident. It was a warning about what happens when power manipulates money while ignoring long-term consequences. More than 1,500 years later, that warning still matters. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history and economics, subscribe for more stories that connect the ancient world to modern life. Because sometimes the best way to understand the future is to study the rise and fall of the past.